Hey guys, today I'm doing a DC jack repair on a Lenovo Legion laptop. We do these repairs for $69 parts and labor at PCRepairHelp.net. And this one came in with a really loose jack, a very loose connection where you plug the power cord into the back of the laptop, which is a typical power jack failure symptom. The thing should feel and fit nice and snug, but it's just incredibly loose, and you can kind of angle the cord in just the right way to get the battery to charge and to get the laptop to power on. But as soon as you let it go, it just shuts off. So it definitely has a bad power jack that needs to be replaced. And you can see a little bit of a physical damage there on it. And the first thing to do in any jack repair diagnosis is just make sure that you do have a working cord. This jack was obviously loose, but it's always good to test the cord. And I use a multimeter to test it, and I put the ground on the outside of the plug and the power on the inside. And you can see that it's reading a solid voltage here of 21 volts in this case. So the cord is more than likely good. Just keep in mind the one caveat is that this is under no load. It's just sitting here, so there's a chance. Sometimes I've seen cords in the past where they do have voltage on them when you test them, but they're not doing anything, they're just sitting there, so just take that into consideration too. And the first step is just to remove all the screws of the bottom panel, and then this big bottom panel will be able to come off. And now that all the screws are removed, I can take my pry tool, I prefer a guitar pick, and start to get it in between the seam of the laptop and the bottom case here. And you just want to go around the edge so you can pop up that bottom panel and remove it. So just carefully get this thing up, and then once you pry it up, that bottom panel will remove. And the first step, once you get the bottom panel off, is you want to detach the battery. You don't want the laptop to have any power while you're working on it. So you just detach this plug here, and that'll cut power from the computer completely. And I started to unscrew the battery because I wanted to remove it, but then I realized that you have to remove this little bottom panel first, this little metal plate. So there's 3 screws that hold that into place, and you remove those and take that little metal plate off. So now I can remove one of the SSDs. And that'll give me access to the screws to remove the battery. And then I remove the other SSD on the other side. And I'm detaching the Wi-Fi leads. You can just pry those up, they'll come right off. And then I'm going to detach some motherboard cables here, the keyboard and touchpad and everything else sitting there. Speaker cable next. And I like to pry up the CMOS battery and not detach it so I don't clear the BIOS settings. And I'm detaching I believe the touchpad here. Now I'm going to detach the fan wires. Now I'm going to remove the heatsink. These just unscrew, the screws don't actually come out. And then that can be removed. Next I'm going to remove the left and the right fan. And now I'm going to detach the little ribbon cable from the small I/O board. This is a flip up, flip down lock connection like the other ones. And I want to detach this cable and just get it pried up. It's a little bit, it's got some sticky stuff on it on one side that's going to have to be pulled up. And then I'm going to detach the screen cable. That's also a flip up, flip down connection for that ribbon cable. And now I'm just removing the DC jack harness. It's two screws that hold this little metal plate over the jack, and that can be removed. And now I'm just removing another little harness. And now I'm removing the motherboard screws. And after those motherboard screws are removed, you can take the motherboard out. But first, on some of these Lenovos, make sure you flip it over and make sure that backlight cable is not plugged in on the bottom. That seems to be a common thing that they do, which is another flip up, flip down lock style connection. And now you have access to the broken jack. So now we're going to start the desoldering process. I like to use this Kimtronics desoldering braid. It's the best braid I've been able to find. And the first step here is to put some flux on these solder points. This really helps get the solder flowing through the hole, and you really need it in a case like some of these Lenovo Legions. But this will just make your life a lot easier when you're trying to desolder. And now I'm actually going to add some solder to these solder points to try to get everything heated up and flowing. The solder that they have on there originally just does not come out very well. You really got to heat it up and get it flowing and get that hole nice and hot so it'll actually come out into the braid. On this side here, just be careful of that LED next to the soldering iron. Try not to touch that with any heat. And so now after all the solder's been added and the flux is in there, I can start taking that desoldering braid and sucking up the solder from the holes. And each time I stop there, I'm just cutting the old solder braid that has a bunch of solder on it, because you don't want it to touch the components near the jack. So there I have to stop and cut the piece off and go back to it. And this can be kind of a long process here, just trying to get all that solder out of the hole as best you can. Here I'm using a Hakko soldering iron. It's the FX888D. Usually I'm doing it right around 650 degrees. And you want to try to hit each one of these holes from each side of it, but this one can be really tricky. The solder definitely does not want to come out of these holes. And if you find after you've done the desoldering that there's still some in there, sometimes you have to start this process over again, or you might need something like a surface mount soldering station, which we're going to use here shortly, because the solder just does not come out of some of these holes. Sorry, my hand's blocking the view here, but I'm just still desoldering these holes. Now I'm just taking some 99% alcohol and cleaning up the flux off of here. Let me get this thing ready for the surface mount soldering, the air soldering station. And I don't like to have flux on the board when I'm applying heat to the jack area. There's two solder points on each side on the back that are just particularly pesky, and the solder just will not come out of there. So the only way to remedy that is to get the air soldering station out and do it that way. I'd say about 10% of the time on laptops I'm working on, I'm going to have to use air soldering. So now this is some electrical heat tape that I want to surround the components around the jack so they don't get damaged from the hot air about to put on this thing. This will help protect the little components, those little chips next to the jack. You don't want those to have hot air blown on them. They could just get removed, which would obviously be very, very bad. I'm just trying to line these up so all the components there are protected. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side of the motherboard. And now we're ready to go over to the air soldering station to finish this thing up. And I typically run the air soldering station around 375 degrees. And this takes a little while for this to heat up here, about 3 or 4 minutes roughly. I just try to evenly distribute that hot air along those points. And in this case, on this Lenovo Legion, I try to keep it away from that LED on the side of the jack there. I don't like to try to put no heat if possible on that. The whole board's going to get heated up anyway around that jack area, so just try to keep the heat off of that LED. I don't want to ruin that part. But I'm keeping that air gun about 1 inch away from the jack. It's kind of hard to tell from this angle, but right around 1 inch above it. I don't want to place it directly above the port, just about 1 inch. And then I take my tweezers with my other hand and I kind of check to see if it's loose. And you can physically tell too, the solder points will look nice and shiny. They're starting to flow there. So now it's starting to feel a little bit loose, but still has a little bit to go. So now it's getting really loose. I know what I'm doing is working. I'm going to keep that air gun on there. I just keep going around to each of the points and trying to keep that heat on them. And that point that I'm holding on right now is the one you can tell is causing the problem. And there we go. And now we got the old jack off of there, and it's time to solder a new one on. You want to let that board cool for a little bit. I'd say about 5 minutes before you start taking off the tape and getting it ready. So there is a little time lapse here of me letting that board cool down. So now the board's cooled down, I got the tape removed. I can start the desoldering process again. And I'm pretty much going to do the same thing as I did before. I'm going to add some flux, I'm going to add some solder, get the holes flowing in again, and try to remove the remaining solder that's left in there. So same as before, I'm just going to take the braid, just suck all the solder out of that through hole. And now I'm just taking my tweezer here. It's a really thin, sharp tweezer point. I'm just pushing some of that solder out of there and making sure that hole is good for the new jack. Sometimes no matter what you do, there's still some solder left in there. Even if after the air soldering and the desoldering braid, you just can't get all of it out. You can kind of push a little bit of it through the hole with a fine tweezers. Just need to be really careful when you're doing that you don't damage the hole. But if it's all heated up, it's going to push through pretty easily, so you're not applying too much force on there. And now I'm just checking to make sure the jack fits in there nicely. And it's got a nice snug fit. And once again, I'm going to take my 99% alcohol and clean all the flux off the board. I put a little tool under there just to make sure that jack doesn't fall through when I'm trying to do the soldering part. Make sure you keep it nice and flush with the motherboard. And now I'm just going to add some solder to each one of these points. Sometimes I use flux here and sometimes I don't. There is flux built into the solder, but if it's flowing through nicely, you don't need flux. But if you find that it's not going through the through holes very well, you can add some flux to help that. But here they're flowing pretty nicely, so I don't really need to add any extra flux in this case. And now I'm just going to add some solder to the other side. Just make sure it's nice and flowed through on each side here. And once again, going to clean up the remaining flux with my alcohol. And now we're all set to get the laptop put back together. I didn't put that part in the video, but you can just put everything back the way it was. And now we got the new port installed, and we're going to put this thing back together and power it up. Thanks for watching, guys.